The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Crossroads Junction's dusty main street as a stranger rode in on a steel gray stallion. Unlike typical drifters who passed through, this one didn't immediately head for the saloon. Instead, he sat motionless in his saddle for several long moments, studying the town with eyes the color of winter ice. Winters hadn't chosen Crossroads Junction for any particular reason. It was just another stop on an endless journey. His dark duster bore the dust of 1,000 miles, and the silver streak in his hair caught the dying sunlight like a crack in old leather. The townsfolk who noticed him quickly looked away, unsettled by his stillness and the way he seemed to fade into the shadows despite sitting in plain sight. The town itself was larger than most he'd passed through recently. 2 rows of buildings lined the main street, their weathered facades telling stories of boom times and lean years. A church steeple rose above the rooftops to the north, while the imposing bulk of the Red River Saloon dominated the south end. Between them, life in Crossroads Junction played out like a well-worn stage play. Mothers hurrying children home for supper, merchants closing shops, and the first evening revelers making their way toward the saloon's welcoming glow. The only sound as Caleb finally dismounted was the soft creak of well-oiled leather and the barely audible whisper of his boots hitting dirt. His spurs, worn smooth from years of use, made less noise than a falling feather. Will Freeman, the young stable master, was closing up when he heard, or rather felt, someone approach. He turned to find the stranger standing there, holding the reins of his horse with one hand and offering a silver dollar with the other. No words were spoken, just a slight nod toward an empty stall. "Yes, sir, I'll take good care of him," Will said, accepting both the reins and the coin. He couldn't help but notice the way the stranger's coat parted slightly, revealing a well-worn gun belt and an ivory-handled Colt that seemed to possess the same quiet deadliness as its owner. "We've got fresh hay and clean water. Your horse will be comfortable here." The stranger nodded once in acknowledgement. As he turned to leave, Will caught a glimpse of something else, a thin scar that ran from the man's left ear to his collar, the kind that could only come from a knife fight at very close range. The young stable master had seen enough fighters to know the difference between someone who carried a gun for show and someone who carried it like a part of their own body. This man was definitely the latter. The sound of raucous laughter drew Caleb's attention to the Red River Saloon across the street. Through the windows, he could see members of the Blackburn Brigade sprawled across several tables, already deep in their cups despite the early hour. The notorious gang had been terrorizing the territory for months, and rumor had it they were planning something big. As Caleb watched, Mountain Mike Harrison grabbed a serving girl's arm, yanking her onto his lap while his companions roared with laughter. The Walker twins, Frank and Fred, were playing some sort of knife game at a nearby table, their identical faces twisted in cruel grins as they terrorized anyone who came too close. The girl's face showed fear, but also resignation. This wasn't the first time, and the town's sheriff was conveniently absent. For a moment, something flickered in Caleb's ice-blue eyes, a hint of emotion quickly buried beneath his customary stillness. He'd sworn to avoid trouble, to keep moving, to stay away from situations that might lead to violence. But as he stood there, the weight of his gun felt heavier than usual, like an old friend nudging him toward an uncomfortable truth. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Ruby Turner, her arms full of supplies for her general store. She paused when she saw him, taking in his travel-worn appearance and the subtle way he carried himself like a coiled spring. Unlike others who hurried past with downcast eyes, she met his gaze directly. "Are you looking for something specific in our little town, mister?" she asked, her direct manner a sharp contrast to the fearful glances of other passers-by. Her voice carried a strength that suggested she'd faced her share of trouble before. Caleb turned those winter-cold eyes on her and, for the first time that day, spoke. His voice was soft as shadow, but clear as breaking ice. "Just passing through, ma'am. Though I expect I'll need some supplies before I move on." Ruby nodded toward her store. Well, you'll find what you need there. Though I'd suggest waiting until morning. Those boys across the street tend to get meaner as the night goes on. We've already lost 2 good men who tried to stand up to them." As if to emphasize her point, another burst of laughter erupted from the saloon, followed by the sound of breaking glass and a woman's frightened cry. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance. A subtle adjustment that made him seem somehow more present, more solid. The air around him seemed to grow still, like the moment before a storm breaks. "Appreciate the warning," he said quietly, though his eyes never left the saloon's swinging doors. "But I've learned it's best to handle some things before they have a chance to grow worse." Ruby studied him for a moment, noting how his right hand rested casually near his hip, the way his feet had shifted almost imperceptibly into a shooter's stance. "Just remember, stranger, this town's seen enough trouble lately. We don't need any more bodies in our cemetery." Caleb finally looked back at her, and for just a moment, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am. I've seen enough of those myself." Then he stepped off the boardwalk and headed toward the saloon, his footsteps as quiet as his reputation, leaving Ruby to wonder if she'd just witnessed the beginning of Crossroads Junction's salvation or its destruction. What no one in Crossroads Junction knew, not yet, was that they were about to witness why some called him Whisper. Not because he was shy or soft-spoken, but because by the time you heard him coming, it was already too late. The Red River Saloon fell quiet for exactly 3 heartbeats when Caleb pushed through the swinging doors. The piano player's fingers hesitated over the keys. Card players paused mid-deal, and even the Walker twins stopped their knife game. Only Mountain Mike Harrison, still holding the terrified serving girl, seemed too drunk to notice the shift in atmosphere. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the sawdust-covered floor and illuminating trails of smoke that hung in the air like lost spirits. The saloon itself was a testament to better days. Ornate mirrors behind the bar bore spiderweb cracks from past brawls, and the once fine wallpaper had faded to a tired shade of burgundy. Brass spittoons dotted the floor, and a mounted buffalo head watched the scene unfold with glass eyes that had seen too many similar confrontations. The silence broke with a harsh laugh from Frank Walker. "Well, look what the wind blew in, brother," he said, nudging his twin. "Some kind of fancy-dressed undertaker." "Nah," Fred replied, running his thumb along his knife blade. "Too dusty for an undertaker. Probably just another saddle tramp looking for a warm bed and a cold drink." The identical grins they wore suggested they'd found their evening's entertainment. Their matching cavalry jackets, stolen from a military supply wagon months ago, were stained with substances best left unidentified. Caleb moved to the bar with quiet grace, seemingly deaf to the taunts. Each step was precisely placed, his spurs remaining silent against the wooden floor. The bartender, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a badly healed broken nose, approached cautiously. Behind his practiced, neutral expression lay the weary look of someone who'd seen too many good men carried out feet first. "What'll it be, mister?" the bartender asked, his hand never straying far from the shotgun mounted under the bar. "Water," Caleb said softly, placing a coin on the worn wood. The word rippled through the saloon like a pebble in a stagnant pond, drawing snickers from the Blackburn Brigade members. Several regular patrons began quietly moving toward the doors, recognizing the familiar signs of impending violence. "Did you hear that, boys?" Mountain Mike called out, finally shoving the serving girl aside. She stumbled, but caught herself on a nearby table, years of practice evident in her quick recovery. "Man rides into the finest establishment in Crossroads Junction and orders water." His massive frame shook with laughter as he stood, towering over most men in the room. "You sure you don't want some warm milk instead, little man?" The serving girl, Sally by name, though none of the brigade ever bothered to learn it, took advantage of her release to slip behind the bar. Her cheeks were flushed with anger and humiliation, but her eyes showed a spark of hope as she watched the quiet stranger. She'd seen plenty of would-be heroes come and go, most of them now resting in the cemetery. But something about this one was different. Caleb didn't respond, didn't even turn around. He simply lifted the glass of water to his lips and took a slow sip. This seemed to infuriate Mountain Mike even more. The giant's face reddened, veins standing out on his thick neck like rope. "I'm talking to you, stranger," the giant growled, taking 3 heavy steps forward. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and a half-empty whiskey bottle rattled off a nearby table. "Ain't you got any manners? Where I come from, it's rude not to answer when spoken to." "Where I come from," Caleb replied, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the room like wind through a graveyard. "It's rude to put hands on unwilling women." He still hadn't turned around, but his reflection in the cracked bar mirror showed eyes as cold and distant as mountain peaks in winter. The saloon grew quiet again, but this time with anticipation. Mountain Mike's face darkened like a thundercloud. "You trying to tell me how to conduct my business, boy?" His right hand strayed closer to his gun belt, worn low on his hip in the gunfighter style he'd adopted but never properly mastered. "No." Caleb took another sip of water. "Just making an observation." Each word was carefully measured, like a man weighing bullets on a scale. The Walker twins had risen from their table, moving to flank Mountain Mike with the practiced coordination of predators. Their matching grins had taken on a predatory edge, made more menacing by the identical scars that curved along their left cheeks, a trademark they'd earned in a Mexican prison. "Seems to me," Frank said, spinning his knife between his fingers, "this fellow needs a lesson in local customs." "Seems to me," Fred added, mirroring his brother's movements perfectly, "he needs to learn his place." Caleb finally turned, those ice-blue eyes scanning the room with deliberate slowness. He noted the positions of all 5 brigade members, the twins to his left, Mountain Mike directly ahead, and 2 more by the card table trying to circle behind him. The way they moved told him everything he needed to know. They were killers, yes, but undisciplined ones. "I know my place," Caleb said quietly. "Do you know yours?" The question hung in the air like gun smoke after a firefight. Mountain Mike's laugh boomed through the saloon. "Boys, did you hear that? This little whisper of a man thinks he can—" "I think," Caleb interrupted, his soft voice somehow cutting through Mike's bluster like a knife through butter, "that you're all used to being the wolves in this town, but you might want to consider something." He set his glass down with exaggerated care. "Sometimes what looks like a sheep is actually something else entirely. Is that supposed to be a threat?" Mountain Mike's hand moved toward his gun, his face twisted in an ugly snarl. "No." Caleb's eyes grew colder still, like a frozen lake in the deepest winter. "Just another observation. Like how the Walker twins favor their left legs slightly, which means they'll draw high and to the right. Or how your gun belt rides low on the right hip, suggesting you rely more on strength than speed." His gaze shifted to the men behind him without turning his head. "Or how your friends back there are breathing too hard already, nervous about what's coming." The silence in the saloon was absolute. Even the drunks at the far tables had gone still, sensing the tension in the air. The afternoon sun had dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the room, as if nature itself was setting the stage. "You sure talk pretty for a dead man," Mountain Mike snarled, his fingers twitching near his holster. Caleb sighed, a sound so soft it was almost lost in the tension. "I gave you a chance to walk away. Remember that." His eyes moved to the bartender. "Sorry about the mess that's coming. What happened next would be talked about in Crossroads Junction for years to come. 5 of the most notorious outlaws in the territory against 1 quiet stranger. And it was over before anyone could blink." The morning after the saloon incident dawned bright and clear over Crossroads Junction, the sun painting the town in shades of gold as if trying to wash away the violence of the previous evening. Sheriff Emma Hawkins stood in front of the Red River Saloon, her badge catching the early light as she surveyed the damage with a mixture of concern and grudging admiration. 5 members of the Blackburn Brigade lay in Doc Thompson's office, none dead, but all nursing wounds that would remind them of their mistake for months to come. Mountain Mike's massive frame took up 2 cots. His pride hurt worse than his shooting hand. The Walker twins had matching bandages on their gun arms, and their perfect coordination hadn't helped them when Caleb had used one brother as a shield against the other. Never seen anything like it, the bartender was saying, still shaking his head in disbelief as he swept broken glass into neat piles. 5 shots, 5 men down, and he never even moved from that spot by the bar. Didn't kill one of them either, just made sure they wouldn't be causing trouble for a good long while. Sheriff Hawkins knelt to examine a bullet hole in the floorboard. And you say he ordered water? Just water? Yes, ma'am. Paid for it too, even after all the ruckus. Left an extra $1 for the damages, though it'll take more than that to fix everything. The bartender gestured at the shattered mirrors and splintered furniture. Emma! Ruby Turner's voice cut through the morning air as she hurried across the street from her general store. Is it true what they're saying about the stranger? The sheriff straightened up, adjusting her gun belt out of habit. Depends on what they're saying. I've heard 10 different versions already this morning, each one wilder than the last. Well, he's in my store right now, Ruby said, lowering her voice. Buying supplies, calm as you please, like last night never happened. There's something different about him, Emma. He's not like the other gunmen we've seen before. Before the sheriff could respond, Brother Thomas appeared, his black preacher's coat collecting dust as he joined their conversation. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he said, though his eyes held a knowing look that suggested he might have seen similar mysteries before. Perhaps he sent us a guardian angel. Angels don't usually carry 6-shooters, Brother Thomas, Sheriff Hawkins replied dryly. And they don't typically show up just when the Blackburn Brigade's planning something big. The mention of Colonel Blackburn cast a shadow over the group. Everyone knew the brigade members in the saloon were just the advance party. The colonel himself was rumored to be gathering his full force for something major. And now, 5 of his men had been humiliated by a stranger. He'll come looking for revenge, Ruby said, voicing what they were all thinking. Blackburn won't let this stand. The conversation paused as Hank Steam Hand Morrison limped by, his mechanical arm glinting in the morning sun. The blacksmith nodded to the group before adding his own thoughts. Saw him at first light, leading his horse to my shop. Asked me to check its shoes. Polite as you please. Man knows his horse flesh and his steel. He flexed his mechanical fingers meaningfully. Recognized the craftsmanship of my arm right off. Said he'd seen similar work during the war. The war? Sheriff Hawkins's eyes narrowed. Which side? Didn't ask, didn't tell? Morrison shrugged. But he paid in Union gold, if that means anything. Will Freeman joined them next, still excited from his morning's encounter. You should see how he treats his horse. Got me teaching the animal some special signals. Says a quiet horse is as important as a quiet rider when trouble's brewing. Martha Old Fox Sullivan, who had somehow materialized among them without anyone noticing her approach, clicked her tongue. Trouble's been brewing since Blackburn set his sights on our town. Question is, what side of it is this stranger really on? The group fell silent as Caleb himself emerged from the general store, his arms full of supplies. He moved with that same fluid grace, acknowledging their presence with a slight nod but offering no words. The silence held until he disappeared around the corner. Well, Brother Thomas said finally, whatever his purpose here, I suspect we'll all find out soon enough. Colonel Blackburn isn't known for his patience, or his mercy, Ruby added softly, remembering the last time someone had stood up to the brigade. Sheriff Hawkins touched her badge thoughtfully. Keep your eyes open, all of you. And maybe say a prayer or two, Brother Thomas? Something tells me Crossroads Junction is about to become the center of a storm. As if in response to her words, a hot wind gusted down the street, carrying with it the first hints of desert dust. Somewhere in the distance, Thunder rolled across the mountains like the drums of war. The afternoon heat shimmered off the desert hardpan as a cloud of dust approached Crossroads Junction from the south. Through his spyglass, Caleb counted at least 15 riders, their horses pushing hard despite the punishing sun. At their head rode a figure in a tattered Confederate officer's coat, Colonel Augustus Blackburn himself, come to answer the insult dealt to his men. From his vantage point on the church steeple, where he'd been helping Brother Thomas repair storm damage, Caleb watched the approaching force with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything. The wind carried the faint jingle of spurs and the creak of saddle leather, along with the distinctive sound of rifle scabbards slapping against horse flanks. "Looks like trouble's found us sooner than expected," Brother Thomas said, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "Those are Blackburn's elite riders, the ones he used to rob the Santa Fe Railroad last spring. 15 good men died that day." Caleb collapsed the spyglass with a soft click. 17. 2 passengers tried to fight back. His voice carried a weight that suggested he knew more than just newspaper accounts of the incident. Down in the street, Sheriff Hawkins was already mobilizing what passed for law enforcement in Crossroads Junction. Will Freeman ran from building to building, warning people to stay inside, while Hank Morrison began securing the heavy shutters on his blacksmith shop with his mechanical arm. "You don't have to stay," Brother Thomas said quietly. "You've done enough already. No one would blame you for riding out." A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips. "Running's what got me here in the first place. Maybe it's time to stop?" He started down the ladder, each movement precise and measured. "Besides, someone once told me that the Lord works in mysterious ways." The preacher's knowing laugh followed him down. "I don't recall the good book mentioning 6-shooters as instruments of divine will." "Then you might want to read it again," Caleb replied, reaching the ground. "David had his sling. I have this." His hand rested briefly on the ivory-handled Colt. The approaching riders were close enough now that their individual features became clear. Colonel Blackburn cut an imposing figure despite his years, his gray hair and beard meticulously trimmed in contrast to his battle-worn uniform. Flanking him were the infamous Pierce brothers, former cavalry scouts turned outlaws, and behind them rode a mix of Mexican bandits and Confederate deserters, all hardened killers. Ruby Turner stood in the doorway of her store, a Winchester rifle held confidently in her hands. "You should have killed them last night," she called to Caleb as he passed. "The ones in the saloon would have been 5 less to deal with now." "Killing's easier than living with the killing," he answered, not breaking stride. "Sometimes mercy leaves a deeper mark than murder." The town had gone eerily quiet, with only the hot wind and the approaching hoofbeats breaking the silence. Sheriff Hawkins stood in the middle of the street, her badge gleaming defiantly in the sun. Her deputy, a young man barely out of his teens, tried to match her steady stance, but couldn't quite hide his trembling hands. "This isn't your fight," the sheriff said as Caleb joined her. "You don't owe this town anything." "No," he agreed, "but sometimes a fight picks you." He studied the approaching riders with those winter-cold eyes. "You might want to get your deputy off the street. He's not ready for what's coming." Before she could respond, the thunder of hooves announced the brigade's arrival. They reined up in a cloud of dust at the edge of town, spreading out in a practiced formation that spoke of military training. Colonel Blackburn urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves striking sparks from the hard-packed earth. "Well, well," the colonel's voice carried the cultured accent of old Virginia, incongruous with his current occupation. "So this is the man who had the temerity to lay hands on my boys. I must admit, you're not quite what I expected." Caleb said nothing, but his stillness seemed to intensify, like the air before a lightning strike. "Not much for conversation, are you?" Blackburn's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's fine. We're not here to talk. You hurt 5 of my men, made them look like fools. That requires a response." "They did that themselves," Caleb replied softly. "I just helped them realize it." A muscle twitched in Blackburn's jaw. "You know, I've heard whispers about a man like you. They say there's a ghost that follows trouble across the territories, leaving broken men but no bodies in his wake. Some call him Whisper. He leaned forward in his saddle. They also say he's running from something, or someone. For the first time, something flickered in Caleb's ice-blue eyes. A recognition, or perhaps a warning. The air seemed to grow thicker, heavier with unspoken threats. "Here's my offer," Blackburn continued. "Join us. A man with your skills could go far in my organization. No more running, no more looking over your shoulder. What do you say?" "I've had better offers from better men," Caleb replied, his soft voice carrying across the dusty street. "And they're all dead now." The tension broke as Colonel Blackburn threw back his head and laughed, though the sound held no warmth. "Well, boys, it seems our friend here prefers to do things the hard way." He straightened in his saddle, all traces of humor vanishing. "You have until sundown to reconsider. After that—" He let the threat hang in the air before wheeling his horse around. As the brigade rode out, Sheriff Hawkins turned to Caleb. "You've bought us a few hours at least, but we both know they'll be back." "With twice the numbers," Caleb corrected quietly. He sent riders to the south camp before sundown. His eyes remained fixed on the dust cloud of departing riders. "You should evacuate the town. This is our home." Ruby's voice cut through the tension as she approached, rifle still in hand. "We're not running." Something in the way she said it made Caleb turn to study her more carefully. The sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair, and for the first time, he noticed the small scar above her right eyebrow, the kind that comes from standing your ground when others would have fallen. She met his gaze without flinching, a feat few had managed. "The last time Blackburn's men came through," she continued, "they killed my father, shot him down right where you're standing, because he refused to pay their protection money." Her knuckles whitened on the rifle stock. "I buried him out back of the store, next to the rose bushes he planted for my mother." "I'm not leaving him alone." Caleb's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "A grave's no place to die for." "No," Ruby agreed, "but some things are worth dying for." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothing. "I've seen plenty of guns for hire pass through Crossroads Junction, Mr. Winters. Most of them were all swagger and no substance. But you're different. You don't want to kill, but you know how. You don't look for trouble, but you don't run from it either." "Running's what kept me alive this long," he replied. But there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Is that what you call living?" She gestured at his worn duster, the trail dust that spoke of endless miles, always moving, never stopping long enough to let the dust settle. Before he could respond, Martha Old Fox Sullivan's voice rang out from her boarding house porch. "Well, if you two are done making eyes at each other, perhaps we should discuss how to keep our town from becoming a battlefield." Ruby stepped back, a flush coloring her cheeks, while Caleb's face returned to its usual unreadable mask. But something had shifted between them, like a key turning in a long-rusted lock. "The old fox has a point," Sheriff Hawkins interjected. "We need a plan. Blackburn's men will hit us from all sides when they come. They've done it before in other towns." "Then we'll need to be ready on all sides," Ruby said, her professional manner returning. "My store has a clear view of the main street. The upper floor could make a good position." Caleb shook his head. "Too obvious. They'll expect that." He turned in a slow circle, studying the town with a tactician's eye. "We need to change the rules of their game." "What do you mean?" the sheriff asked. "Blackburn thinks like a soldier," Caleb explained, his soft voice taking on a teacher's patience. "He'll approach this like a military operation because that's what he knows. We need to make this personal." Ruby watched him closely. "You've faced him before, haven't you?" That's what he meant about running from someone. For a long moment, Caleb was silent, his eyes distant, as if seeing something far beyond the dusty streets of Crossroads Junction. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than ever. 2 years ago, Blackburn and his men raided a mission hospital in Arizona Territory. They were looking for medical supplies, but things got out of hand. By the time they left, 12 people were dead, including 3 children. His hand unconsciously touched the scar that ran from his ear to his collar. I was there, recovering from another matter. Couldn't stop them, could barely stand. But I made a promise to the dying that day. What kind of promise? Ruby asked gently. The kind that keeps a man moving, he replied, meeting her eyes. The kind that doesn't let him rest until it's fulfilled. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it the first hints of evening cool. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, marking the hours until sundown. Well, Ruby said finally, maybe it's time to stop moving and start standing. She reached out and brushed some dust from his sleeve, the gesture surprisingly intimate. We may not be much, but Crossroads Junction takes care of its own. And right now, that includes you. For the first time since he'd ridden into town, something like warmth crept into Caleb's winter-cold eyes. You don't know what you're asking. Maybe not, she smiled. But I know what I'm offering. A chance to stop running. To find something worth fighting for besides old promises to the dead. The church's main hall was packed with townsfolk as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Brother Thomas stood near the altar, his usual serene expression replaced by one of grim determination. Sheriff Hawkins leaned against a wall, her badge catching the light from the stained glass windows, while Ruby sat in the front pew, her rifle across her lap. Caleb stood before them all, his quiet presence somehow filling the space more effectively than any shouted speech could have. The townsfolk watched him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The stranger who had become their unlikely defender. Blackburn will come from 3 directions, he began, his soft voice carrying to every corner of the church. He'll have men approaching from the north and south ends of Main Street, and another group coming in from behind the livery stable. It's how he took Cedar Ridge last year. And you know this because? Sheriff Hawkins asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Because I was there, Caleb replied, his eyes distant. Watching from the hills, learning his tactics, understanding how he thinks. He paused, scanning the faces before him. That's why I know what he expects. And we're going to do something different? Hank Morrison raised his mechanical hand. Different how? We're outnumbered 3-1, even if every man and woman here picks up a gun. Numbers don't always tell the whole story, Caleb said, moving to the crude map he'd drawn on the church's blackboard. Blackburn thinks like a soldier, but this isn't a battlefield. It's your home. Every alley, every rooftop, every cellar. You know them better than his men ever could. Ruby stood, understanding dawning in her eyes. We can use the tunnels? A murmur ran through the crowd. During the town's early days, a network of tunnels had been dug beneath the streets, originally for moving supplies during Apache raids. Most had been forgotten, but a few were still accessible. Exactly, Caleb nodded. But first, we need to change how Blackburn sees this fight. He's expecting a straightforward resistance, men with guns behind windows and doors. We need to show him something else entirely. Martha Old Fox Sullivan cackled from her seat near the back. Oh, I like where this is going. We're going to put on a show for them, aren't we? More than that, Caleb replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. We're going to give them exactly what they expect, just not where they expect it. He turned to Will Freeman. How many empty barrels do we have in town? Couple dozen at least between the store and the saloon. Good. We'll need them all, and every spare piece of clothing you can find. Caleb's eyes took on an intensity that made several people shift in their seats. By the time Blackburn arrives, this town is going to look like it's defended by twice the people we actually have. For the next hour, Caleb laid out his plan. The townsfolk listened, asked questions, and began to see how their knowledge of Crossroads Junction could become a weapon more powerful than any gun. Children who knew every hiding spot, women who could move through back gardens unseen, Men who remembered the old tunnel routes. Every piece of local knowledge became part of the strategy. But what about the actual fighting? Someone called out. Most of us ain't never fired a gun in anger. That's why we're not going to fight the way they expect, Caleb explained. Sheriff Hawkins and her deputy will be visible on Main Street, making a show of organizing a defense. Meanwhile, Ruby and 3 others will be moving through the tunnels, ready to emerge behind their lines. Brother Thomas, I need you and Martha to coordinate the movement of our decoys. Make those barrels and dummy figures count. He turned to Hank Morrison. Your shop is going to be their primary target. They'll want to prevent us from getting to the horses. I need you to make it look defended, but empty. A trap? The blacksmith asked, flexing his mechanical fingers. Of sorts, Caleb nodded. But not the kind they're used to. As the meeting continued, Ruby watched Caleb closely. The hesitation she'd seen earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that seemed to spread through the crowd. This was a man who had spent years running, watching, learning, and now all that knowledge was being put to use, not for destruction, but for protection. When the planning was done and people began to file out to their assigned tasks, Ruby approached him. You've done this before, haven't you? Not just observed it, but planned it. Caleb was quiet for a moment, staring at the map he'd drawn. Once, during the war. Different circumstances, different people, but the same principles. He turned to face her. It worked then, but the cost was high, she finished for him. Too high. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. That's why I started running. Why I stopped letting myself care what happened to people and places. Ruby laid a hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. But you care now, don't you? Despite trying not to. Before he could answer, Sheriff Hawkins called from the church door. Ryder coming in from the south, one of our lookouts. The moment broke, and Caleb moved quickly to the door, Ruby close behind. In the dying light, they could see a horse and rider approaching at full gallop, dust rising behind them like a signal fire. They're coming, the rider shouted as he reined up. Blackburn's gathered his whole gang, at least 50 men, maybe more. Caleb's expression didn't change, but his hand unconsciously moved to the ivory-handled Colt at his hip. Then we'd better get started. Time to show them what this town is really made of. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and crimson, as Caleb stood in the church bell tower, watching the last preparations take place below.